You stand in the shadowed halls of ancient Mesopotamia, where the first written records of humanity speak of something that preceded civilization itself. Long before the great cities rose along the Tigris and Euphrates, before the pyramids pierced the Egyptian sky, there existed stories, whispered, carved, and eventually written, of beings who descended from the heavens and walked among mortals. These were not gods in the distant, untouchable sense. These were the Watchers, and their story begins not with thunder and glory, but with something far more unsettling: desire. The earliest accounts come from the Book of Enoch, a text that predates much of what you know as the biblical canon. Written sometime between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE, this collection of Hebrew apocalyptic literature describes an event that supposedly occurred in the generations before the Great Flood. 200 angels, led by figures named Semjaza and Azazel, looked down from their celestial realm and saw the daughters of men. What happened next would, according to these ancient scribes, fundamentally alter the trajectory of human history. The Watchers descended. They took human wives. And from these unions came the Nephilim, beings described as giants, heroes, and men of renown. The Hebrew word Nephilim appears in Genesis 6:4, but its meaning has been debated by scholars for millennia. Some translate it as giants. Others prefer fallen ones. Still others suggest it means those who cause others to fall. The ambiguity itself tells you something important. Even the ancient writers struggled to categorize what these beings were. They existed in a liminal space between human and something else, between the known world and the realm of myth. But here is where history becomes tangible rather than mythological. You must understand that these stories were not written in isolation. The ancient Near East was a tapestry of interconnected cultures, each with their own flood narratives, their own tales of divine human hybrids, their own explanations for why certain families seem to possess extraordinary power. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BCE, records rulers whose reigns stretched for thousands of years, impossibly long lives that ended abruptly with a great flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed around 2100 BCE but referencing far older traditions, tells of a hero who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a man of superhuman strength and ambition who sought immortality. These texts were not isolated curiosities. They were living documents, copied and recopied, translated from Sumerian to Akkadian to Aramaic to Greek, carried along trade routes, discussed in scribal schools, memorized by priests. When Jewish scholars in Alexandria translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek in the 3rd century BCE, creating what you know as the Septuagint, they rendered Nephilim as gigantes, giants. This translation choice would echo through centuries, shaping how later generations understood these enigmatic figures. The Book of Enoch goes further than Genesis, providing names, numbers, and specific teachings that the Watchers supposedly shared with humanity. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor, the instruments of warfare. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cutting, the manipulation of plants for magical purposes. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. These were not arbitrary gifts. You can see in this list a catalog of the fundamental technologies and knowledge systems that separated civilized humanity from hunter-gatherers. Metallurgy, agriculture, astronomy, calendrical calculation, meteorology. The text presents these advances not as the gradual accumulation of human wisdom, but as sudden revelations from beings who existed outside the normal order of creation. The implication is profound. Human civilization itself might be the product of forbidden knowledge, passed down from entities who violated cosmic law. The offspring of these unions, the Nephilim, are described in the Book of Enoch as consuming all the resources of humanity. They ate the labor of men, and when that proved insufficient, they began to devour the men themselves, along with birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish. This apocalyptic imagery of hybrid beings whose appetites could not be satisfied served as an explanation for the catastrophic violence that supposedly necessitated the flood. The earth had become corrupted, not just morally, but genetically, and the flood waters served as a cleansing mechanism, wiping the slate clean. Except, the texts suggest, not entirely clean. Genesis 6:4 includes a curious phrase that translators have wrestled with. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. That word afterward opens a door that Orthodox theology has often tried to close. If the Nephilim existed after the flood, if their bloodline somehow survived the catastrophe that was meant to eliminate them, then their story did not end in the antediluvian world. It continued. And if it continued, you must ask, where did it continue? In whom did it continue? And could it continue still? This question becomes more than theoretical when you examine the post-flood narratives. Numbers 13:33 records the report of Israelite spies sent to scout the land of Canaan around 1400 BCE. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Here, centuries after the flood, the Nephilim reappear, associated specifically with the Anakim, a people known for their great stature and strength. The Anakim were not mythological. They were historical inhabitants of Canaan, mentioned in Egyptian texts and in the archaeological record. Their cities, Hebron, Gaza, Gath, were real places that you can still visit today. The biblical narrative presents them as descendants of Anak, whose name means long-necked or giant, and traces their lineage back through various Canaanite peoples. When the Israelites finally conquered Canaan under Joshua, special attention was paid to eliminating the Anakim. Joshua 11:21-22 records that Joshua destroyed the Anakites from the hill country. From Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them in their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. This passage is remarkable for its specificity. It names cities. It describes a deliberate campaign of extermination, and it acknowledges that the task was incomplete. Remnants survived in the Philistine cities of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. This detail matters because of what comes next in the biblical narrative. Roughly 2 centuries later, around 1000 BCE, a young shepherd named David will face a champion from Gath named Goliath, described as being over 9 feet tall, wearing armor that weighed 125 pounds, carrying a spear whose iron point alone weighed 15 pounds. The text explicitly identifies Goliath as a descendant of the Rephaim, another term associated with the Nephilim and giant peoples. You might be tempted to dismiss these measurements as exaggeration, the kind of hyperbole that ancient heroes attract, but the pattern is too consistent, too widespread, and too detailed to ignore completely. The historical record of the ancient Near East is filled with references to unusually large individuals and peoples. The Egyptian pharaoh Senusret 1971 to 1926 BCE, recorded military campaigns against the Hill of E, whose inhabitants were described as being of extraordinary size. Hittite texts from the 2nd millennium BCE reference the men of great stature, who inhabited the regions of Canaan before the arrival of smaller populations. Medical science offers you some context here. Gigantism, caused by excess growth hormone, is a documented medical condition that can produce individuals of extraordinary height, 7, 8, even 9 feet tall. Acromegaly, a related disorder, causes abnormal bone growth in adults, particularly in the hands, feet, and face. These conditions are rare but real, caused by tumors on the pituitary gland. Could the Nephilim simply have been populations with a higher incidence of such disorders, their unusual size mythologized over generations into stories of divine human hybrids? This explanation satisfies modern rationalism, but it struggles with the sheer persistence of the Nephilim narrative across cultures and centuries. The Greek tradition spoke of the Titans and their offspring, beings of enormous power who challenged the Olympian gods. Norse mythology described the Jotnar, giants who represented the chaotic forces of nature. Hindu texts reference the Daityas and Danavas, powerful beings born from the union of gods and mortals. Celtic legends preserve stories of the Fomorians and later the Tuatha De Danann, races of superhuman beings who ruled Ireland before the arrival of ordinary humans. These are not borrowed stories. The Norse sagas developed in isolation from Middle Eastern texts. The Vedic traditions of India evolved independently of Mediterranean mythology. The Celtic narratives emerged from a completely different cultural matrix. Yet they all preserve the same basic structure: beings of extraordinary power and size, often descended from divine or celestial sources, who once walked the earth and whose bloodlines may have persisted in certain royal or aristocratic families. This brings you to the uncomfortable question that lurks beneath all these ancient narratives. What if the pattern is not metaphorical? What if ancient peoples across the world preserved these stories not as religious allegory, but as garbled historical memory of something that actually occurred? And if such bloodlines persisted, if they were deliberately preserved and cultivated, where would you find them today? The answer, according to those who study these traditions most seriously, lies not in the margins of society, but at its very center, in the halls of power, in the lineages of kings and presidents, in the bloodlines that have ruled humanity for millennia. But to understand how this might be possible, you must first understand something that seems mundane: the extraordinary importance that ancient cultures placed on genealogy and the lengths to which powerful families went to preserve what they believed to be sacred bloodlines. You stand now at a crossroads in this investigation. Behind you lie the ancient texts, ambiguous and troubling. Before you stretches the long corridor of recorded history, filled with royal genealogies, dynastic successions, and carefully documented bloodlines. The question that should keep you awake is not whether the Nephilim existed in some ancient, mythological sense. The question is whether their descendants believed they carried a special inheritance, whether they took deliberate steps to preserve it, and whether that belief shaped the course of human civilization in ways you have never considered. Section 2 continues without interruption from this precise moment of questioning. You must now follow those bloodlines forward through history, tracing them as carefully as the scribes and genealogists who first recorded them. The project of documenting royal lineage was not a casual pursuit in the ancient world. It was a sacred duty, a matter of cosmic significance. In Egypt, the pharaohs were not merely kings. They were living gods, incarnations of Horus, maintaining Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. Their bloodline was the conduit through which the gods touched the earth. The pharaonic succession was not simply a matter of primogeniture. the automatic passing of the throne from father to eldest son. It was far more complex, far more deliberate. Egyptian royal marriages frequently occurred between siblings, or between uncles and nieces, or between fathers and daughters. Modern observers recoil from this practice, labeling it incest and attributing it to isolated royal arrogance. But you must understand it in its proper context. These marriages were intended to concentrate and preserve something the Egyptians believed existed in the royal blood itself, a divine essence that would be diluted by marriage to commoners. The 18th dynasty of Egypt, which ruled from approximately 1550 to 1295 BCE, provides you with the most thoroughly documented example of this practice. Ahmose I, who expelled the Hyksos invaders and reunited Egypt, married his sister, Ahmose Nefertari. Their son, Amenhotep I, married a woman who was likely his sister or half-sister. This pattern continued through the dynasty, reaching its most extreme expression in the reign of Tutankhamun, whose parents were full siblings. Modern DNA analysis, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2010, confirmed that Tutankhamun was the product of a brother-sister union, and that he suffered from numerous genetic disorders as a result. But here is what you must grasp. These marriages continued despite their obvious biological drawbacks. The pharaohs and their priests could see the physical consequences, the stillbirths, the deformities, the early deaths. Yet they persisted. This suggests that whatever they believed they were preserving was considered more important than the health costs. What could be so valuable that it justified genetic catastrophe? The royal archives at Amarna, the short-lived capital built by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, ruled 1353 to 1336 BCE, provide tantalizing clues. Akhenaten revolutionized Egyptian religion, abandoning the traditional pantheon in favor of monotheistic worship of the Aten, the sun disk. His artistic representations are unlike any other pharaoh. He is shown with an elongated skull, feminine hips, and an unusually long neck and face. For decades, scholars debated whether these representations were stylistic choices or reflections of actual physical characteristics. Recent analysis of his mummy and genetic studies of his family suggest he may have suffered from Marfan syndrome or another connective tissue disorder that would explain his unusual appearance. But Akhenaten's inscriptions at Amarna claim something else. He repeatedly emphasizes that he is teaching doctrines given to him directly by the Aten, that he has access to knowledge that previous pharaohs did not possess, that his bloodline carries a special relationship to the divine that authorizes his radical reforms. His successors tried to erase him from history, chiseling his name from monuments, destroying his temples, and excluding his reign from official king lists. Was this simply religious conservatism, or were they trying to suppress something more specific about what Akhenaten represented or claimed to represent? You must now move northwest from Egypt to Mesopotamia, where the Sumerian king list presents you with an even more explicit claim about antediluvian bloodlines. This document, composed around 2100 BCE, but referencing much earlier traditions, divides history into two distinct eras, before the flood and after the flood. The pre-flood kings are credited with reigns of impossible length, 43,200 years, 36,000 years, 28,800 years. After the flood, reign lengths drop dramatically, but remain superhuman by modern standards. 625 years, 960 years, 200 years. These numbers are not random. They follow mathematical patterns based on the Sumerian sexagesimal base 60 counting system. Scholars have proposed numerous explanations. The numbers represent dynasties rather than individuals. They encode astronomical data. They reflect scribal errors in transmission. They are purely mythological. But the Sumerians themselves did not present them as mythology. The king list was a practical administrative document used to establish the legitimacy of current rulers by connecting them to an unbroken chain of kingship extending back to the moment when kingship descended from heaven. That phrase, descended from heaven, echoes the language used to describe the Watchers in the Book of Enoch. The first king on the list is Alulim of Eridu, who supposedly reigned for 2,800 years. Eridu is not mythological. It is a real city in southern Mesopotamia, excavated by archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries. The temple complex at Eridu shows continuous occupation and renovation from approximately 5400 BCE until it was abandoned around 600 BCE. The deepest archaeological layers reveal a small shrine that was rebuilt and expanded more than a dozen times over millennia, always on exactly the same spot, always oriented in the same direction, always dedicated to the same god, Enki, god of wisdom, water, and creation. Sumerian mythology presents Enki as the god who warned the flood hero Ziusudra, the Sumerian equivalent of Noah, about the coming deluge, instructing him to build a boat and preserve the seed of all living things. In some versions of the story, Enki does this in defiance of the other gods, who had decided to destroy humanity entirely. Why would Enki preserve humanity against the will of the divine council? The texts suggest he had a particular interest in human civilization, that he had taught humans the arts of irrigation, agriculture, and writing, and that he viewed them as his own creation in a sense that went beyond mere divine patronage. Here you encounter a pattern that will repeat throughout ancient civilizations: the claim of special divine ancestry combined with the preservation of specific bloodlines through careful marriage practices. The Sumerian city-states were ruled by Ensi, priests, and Lugal, kings, who claimed direct descent from the gods. These were not metaphorical claims. Royal marriage contracts from the 3rd millennium BCE specify that both parties must be able to trace their lineage back to specific divine ancestors. Gudea of Lagash, ruled circa 2144 to 2124 BCE, left numerous inscriptions detailing his divine genealogy, tracing his bloodline back through 30 generations to the goddess Ninhursag. You might be tempted to dismiss this as standard royal propaganda, the kind of divine right mythology that every ancient kingdom produced. But the consistency across cultures and the practical consequences of these beliefs demand closer attention. These genealogies were not optional decorations. They were legal requirements for holding power. A ruler whose bloodline could not be verified, who could not produce the documented evidence of sacred descent, would not be accepted as legitimate. Entire wars were fought over competing genealogical claims. This obsession with bloodline preservation intensified rather than diminished as civilizations became more sophisticated. In ancient Israel, the tribal genealogies recorded in books like Numbers and Chronicles were not merely historical curiosities. They determined land ownership, inheritance rights, and eligibility for the priesthood. Only descendants of Aaron could serve as priests in the temple. Only descendants of David could legitimately claim the throne of Judah. The Israelites maintained these records with obsessive precision. And when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BCE and carried the elite into exile, one of the first priorities upon return was reconstituting the genealogical records. The priestly families of the Second Temple period, 516 BCE, 70 CE, guarded their genealogies so carefully that they could trace their lineage back more than 1,000 years. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, claims in his autobiography that he could trace his own priestly ancestry back through official temple records. When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, one of the great losses, alongside the building itself and the sacred objects it contained, was the genealogical archive. Without it, Determining who had legitimate priestly descent became impossible, contributing to the fragmentation of Jewish religious authority in the centuries that followed. But you must notice something peculiar. Even after the destruction of the temple, certain Jewish families continued to maintain their genealogical records privately. The Davidic line, in particular, was preserved through careful documentation. The exilarchs, who led the Jewish community in Babylonia from the 2nd through 11th centuries CE, claimed unbroken descent from King David. They maintained detailed family trees, arranged marriages carefully to preserve the bloodline, and were recognized by both the Jewish community and the ruling Muslim caliphates as possessing a special authority based on their ancestry. This pattern, the preservation of specific bloodlines through deliberate marriage practices, maintained over centuries or millennia, justified by claims of divine or extraordinary ancestry, appears in every major civilization you examine. In Persia, the Achaemenid dynasty, 553-30 BCE, claimed descent from Achaemenes, whose own ancestry was traced back to the gods through carefully maintained genealogies. The royal marriages were almost exclusively between close relatives, creating a tightly interwoven family tree that concentrated power and, they believed, preserved sacred blood. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in 330 BCE, he did not simply eliminate the royal family and install his own administrators. Instead, he married Statera, daughter of the defeated Persian king Darius III, and encouraged his generals to marry Persian noblewomen. This was not merely a diplomatic gesture. Alexander believed in his own divine descent. His mother Olympias claimed that Alexander's true father was not Philip II of Macedon, but Zeus himself, who had visited her in the form of a serpent. By marrying into the Persian royal line, Alexander was not diluting his bloodline, but concentrating different streams of divine heritage. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his generals divided his empire and established their own dynasties. The Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria and Mesopotamia, the Antigonids in Macedonia. Each of these dynasties practiced the same pattern of sibling marriage and carefully controlled bloodlines that characterized the civilizations they had conquered. The Ptolemies, ruling Egypt for 3 centuries, married brother to sister in direct imitation of the pharaohs, claiming to embody both Greek divine descent from the gods and Egyptian pharaonic divinity. Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler, was the product of at least 3 centuries of systematic inbreeding. Her family tree collapses in on itself. The same names appear repeatedly. The same individuals occupy multiple positions as both ancestors and descendants through different lines. Yet Cleopatra was by all accounts brilliant, politically astute, and physically healthy. How did the Ptolemaic line avoid the genetic collapse that destroyed the 18th dynasty of Egypt? Did they occasionally introduce fresh blood from carefully selected sources, or were they simply fortunate in the genetic lottery? These questions matter because the Ptolemaic pattern was not unique. Every royal house in Europe would eventually adopt similar practices, claiming special bloodlines and marrying almost exclusively within a small pool of noble families. But before you can trace those European bloodlines forward to the present day, you must understand the theological framework that gave them meaning. Christianity, emerging in the 1st century CE, would transform how these bloodline claims were understood, not by rejecting them, but by recasting them in a new narrative that made them more rather than less important. The genealogies of Jesus in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are not historical accidents or literary flourishes. They are theological arguments, demonstrating that Jesus possessed the bloodline credentials necessary to fulfill the role of Messiah. Both genealogies trace his descent from David, though through different lines, Matthew through Solomon, Luke through Nathan. This discrepancy has troubled scholars for 2 millennia, producing numerous complex explanations. But you must notice what both genealogies assume. That bloodline descent matters, that it conveys something real and important, that who your ancestors were determines what you can become. Early Christianity struggled with this tension between spiritual equality. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, and the persistent importance of bloodline. The concept of apostolic succession emerged by the late 1st century. The idea that the authority to lead the church passed through a specific lineage from the apostles forward. This was not merely organizational convenience. It reflected a deep belief that something tangible, grace, authority, spiritual power, could be transmitted through a specific line of laying on of hands. But there was another bloodline claim that emerged in early Christianity, one that would have profound historical consequences. The idea that Jesus did not die childless, that he had descendants, and that those descendants carried a special spiritual heritage. This claim appears in fragments, in hints, in texts that were suppressed or destroyed. The Gnostic Gospels, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, include passages suggesting that Mary Magdalene held a special status among the disciples, that she received teachings the others did not, that her relationship with Jesus was more than that of rabbi and student. You must be careful here not to confuse historical investigation with modern mythology. The Da Vinci Code and similar works of fiction have so thoroughly popularized the idea of a Jesus bloodline that serious scholarship on the topic has become almost impossible. But beneath the fiction lies a genuine historical question. Why did certain medieval families claim descent from Jesus? Why were these claims taken seriously by some church authorities? And what political and religious consequences flowed from such claims? The Merovingian dynasty, which ruled the Frankish kingdom from the 5th to 8th centuries CE, is the most thoroughly documented example. These long-haired kings claimed descent from a mythical sea creature and divine ancestry that predated their conversion to Christianity. When they converted, they did not abandon these claims, but rather reframed them, some branches of the family suggesting they possessed a special bloodline going back to Jesus himself through the migration of Mary Magdalene to Gaul. Historical evidence for Mary Magdalene in Gaul is non-existent. But the persistence of the claim tells you something important. In medieval Europe, even in Christian Europe, bloodlines still mattered enough that powerful families would manufacture divine ancestry if they could not document it. And the Church, rather than dismissing these claims as heretical, often accommodated them, blessing royal marriages, maintaining genealogical records in monastery archives, and supporting the concept of divinely ordained kingship. The question that should trouble you as you trace these bloodlines forward through history is not whether the Nephilim were real in a biological sense. The question is whether powerful families believed they carried special ancestry, whether they acted on that belief through carefully controlled marriage practices, whether they saw themselves as fundamentally different from ordinary humanity, and whether that self-perception shaped how they wielded power. If kings and queens across millennia truly believed they were descended from gods or from beings who walked between heaven and earth, how would that belief influence their decisions? How would it shape their sense of responsibility to the people they ruled? And what happens when such bloodlines reach the present day? When your current leaders might carry genealogies linking them to the very families who made these extraordinary claims. Section 3 arrives now at the question of evidence. At the intersection of ancient mythology and documented genealogy, at the point where you must decide what weight to give these persistent claims about special bloodlines. The challenge is that you cannot simply dismiss them as superstition. The people who made and maintained these claims were not foolish or unsophisticated. They were often the best educated, most powerful, most historically consequential individuals of their eras. The development of heraldry in medieval Europe provides you with a concrete example of how seriously these bloodline claims were taken. Heraldry emerged in the 12th century CE as a practical system for identifying armored knights in battle. But it rapidly evolved into a complex, symbolic language encoding family descent, marital alliances, and claims to property and title. The science of heraldry, and it was considered a science, required years of study. Heralds were among the most educated people of their time, maintaining libraries of genealogical records, adjudicating disputes about rightful inheritance, and designing coats of arms that visually represented complex family relationships. What strikes you when examining medieval heraldry is how far back these genealogies reached. European royal houses did not merely trace their ancestry to Charlemagne or William the Conqueror. They pushed their genealogies back through Roman emperors, through Germanic tribal kings, through mythological founders, back to Troy, back to the gods themselves. The kings of Britain claimed descent from Brutus of Troy, great-grandson of Aeneas, himself the son of Venus. The French monarchy traced its line back to the Merovingians and beyond them to mythical founder kings who claimed divine descent. You might argue this was simply medieval people doing what pre-modern peoples always did, creating mythological genealogies to legitimize power. But the genealogies were maintained with extraordinary precision where they could be verified. The ancestry of Edward I of England, 1239 to 1307, can be traced back through documentation, charters, chronicles, church records for more than 2 centuries before his birth, with remarkable accuracy. Where documentation fails, the genealogies become less certain, but do not disappear. They continue backward through the Anglo-Saxon royal lines, through migration period Germanic kings, into the fog of the late Roman period. Modern genetic studies have unexpectedly vindicated some of these ancient genealogical claims. A 2006 genetic study published in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution found that approximately 16 million men alive today in Central Asia carry Y chromosome markers suggesting descent from Genghis Khan, whose empire in the 13th century stretched from China to Eastern Europe. The study identified a specific genetic signature that arose in Mongolia approximately 1,000 years ago and spread rapidly through both conquest and the systematic impregnation of women in conquered territories. This finding confirms something the medieval genealogists always claimed: that bloodlines from powerful rulers could spread widely through populations and remain identifiable centuries later. If Genghis Khan's genetic signature can be detected 800 years after his death, what about bloodlines that were carefully maintained for millennia through deliberate marriage practices? What about royal lines that married almost exclusively with other royal lines, creating isolated genetic populations that would preserve distinctive markers? The Habsburg dynasty, which ruled much of Europe from the 13th to 20th centuries, provides a documented example of this process. The Habsburgs practiced close relative marriage so consistently that by the 18th century, Charles II of Spain, 1661 to 1700, was more inbred than if his parents had been siblings. He suffered from numerous genetic disorders, could barely walk or speak, and died at 38 without producing an heir, ending the Spanish Habsburg line. Modern genetic analysis published in PLOS 1 in 2009 calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, higher than would result from a brother-sister union. Yet the Habsburg line persisted through the Austrian branch, and the family's carefully documented genealogy allows geneticists to trace the accumulation of genetic disorders over centuries. The famous Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism, a protruding lower jaw, can be tracked through portraits and skeletal remains. It was not caused by a single genetic mutation, but by the concentration of multiple recessive genes through repeated inbreeding. What you must recognize is that the Habsburgs knew what they were doing. They could see the physical consequences of their marriage practices. Yet they continued because they believed they were preserving something more important than individual health. A sacred bloodline that conveyed the right to rule. This was not unique to the Habsburgs. The same pattern appears in the royal houses of Prussia, Russia, Britain, and Spain, all of which intermarried constantly, creating what was essentially a single extended family ruling most of Europe by the 19th century. Queen Victoria of Britain, 1819 to 1901, is known not just as the matriarch of a vast empire, but as the carrier of hemophilia, a genetic bleeding disorder that spread through her descendants to the royal houses of Russia, Spain, and Germany. This was not a spontaneous mutation in Victoria herself, as was long assumed. Recent genetic research suggests it may have entered the British royal line through earlier inbreeding, perhaps carried as a recessive gene that only manifested when Victoria's already inbred parents produced a child. Victoria became a carrier and passed the gene to 3 of her 9 children. Through them, it spread to the Romanovs in Russia. Alexandra, wife of Tsar Nicholas II, was Victoria's granddaughter and passed hemophilia to her son Alexei, whose illness influenced the political instability that contributed to the Russian Revolution. This genetic cascade demonstrates something crucial. Bloodlines matter not merely as abstract claims of legitimacy, but as biological realities. What flows through these carefully maintained family trees is not just symbolic, but genetic, and the consequences can be world historical. The hemophilia that Victoria's descendants carried was a direct result of the inbreeding practiced by European royalty for centuries. But if negative genetic traits could be concentrated and transmitted through these bloodlines, what about other traits? What about unusual cognitive abilities, exceptional physical characteristics, or even the various genetic peculiarities that the ancient texts describe in the Nephilim and their descendants? Modern human genetics has revealed something that the ancient genealogists did not know, but might have suspected. Most humans carry genetic material from multiple hominin species. The sequencing of the Neanderthal genome, completed in 2010, revealed that all non-African humans carry approximately 14% Neanderthal DNA, inherited from interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals approximately 50,000–60,000 years ago. Further research identified genetic material from another hominin species, the Denisovans, present in some modern human populations, particularly in Melanesia and Southeast Asia. These findings fundamentally changed how you must think about human ancestry. For most of the 20th century, the dominant theory was that modern humans evolved in Africa and then replaced all other hominin species without interbreeding. This was wrong. The genomic evidence is clear. Your ancestors interbred with other species of humans, and you carry their genetic legacy. The boundaries between human populations were porous, and the offspring of these unions were viable and fertile. If modern humans interbred with Neanderthals, a separate species or subspecies that had evolved in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens arrived, then the biblical and mythological accounts of beings from heaven or from a different order of existence interbreeding with humans become less obviously impossible. You need not take the stories literally as accounts of angels descending from the sky, but you might consider them as garbled memories of encounters between anatomically modern humans and other human species, or between modern humans and populations that had developed unusual genetic characteristics in isolation. The megalithic structures scattered across Europe, the Middle East, and other regions present another angle on this question. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 9600 BCE, was constructed before the development of agriculture, before permanent settlements, before ceramics or metalworking. Yet the site required sophisticated planning, large-scale labor coordination, and advanced stoneworking techniques. The massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, were quarried, carved with complex animal reliefs, transported, and erected by people who were supposedly nomadic hunter-gatherers. Who organized this work? Who possessed the knowledge to plan such structures? The traditional archaeological answer is that the project itself drove the development of social complexity, that the need to build the site led to the invention of agriculture and permanent settlement to support the workforce. But this places the cart before the horse. Someone had to conceive of the project, design it, and possess the authority to mobilize the labor required. Where did that knowledge and authority come from? The ancient texts offer an answer. It was taught by the Watchers, by beings who possessed knowledge beyond what humans should have had at that stage of development. You need not take this literally to recognize the problem it addresses. The archaeological record shows repeated instances of sudden, seemingly spontaneous advances in human capability. The development of metallurgy, the invention of writing, the construction of monumental architecture, that are difficult to explain through gradual evolution alone. The alternative explanation, one that makes some researchers uncomfortable, is that these advances came from small populations that had developed unusual cognitive abilities, either through genetic isolation and evolutionary pressure or through some other process. If such populations existed and intermarried with the larger human population, their knowledge and capabilities would spread. But their genetic distinctiveness might persist in certain family lines that practiced endogamy, marrying within the group. This brings you to the most controversial aspect of the Nephilim hypothesis, not whether unusual beings existed in the ancient past, but whether their descendants deliberately preserved their bloodlines and whether those bloodlines remain identifiable today. The evidence suggests that from the earliest historical records until the present, certain families have claimed special ancestry, have married almost exclusively within a restricted pool to preserve that ancestry, and have wielded disproportionate power and influence. The question that should occupy your mind as you drift towards sleep is not whether you can prove these claims scientifically. The question is, what if the people making these claims believed them? What if kings and queens, priests and presidents have acted for millennia on the assumption that their bloodlines conveyed special rights, special abilities, special destinies? How would that belief shape history? And when you examine who holds power today, when you trace their family trees backward through genealogical records that are public and verifiable, what patterns emerge? Do today's leaders connect to these ancient bloodlines? And if they do, does that connection tell you something important about how power operates and perpetuates itself in human civilization? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. The Nephilim, whether you understand them as literal giants, as genetic anomalies, as mythological representations of human encounters with the other, or as something else entirely, represent a persistent tradition that bloodlines carry meaning, that ancestry determines destiny, and that some humans are fundamentally different from others. That tradition has shaped politics, religion, and social organization throughout recorded history. It deserves your serious attention, not as ancient superstition, but as a belief system that has had profound material consequences for how human societies organize power and privilege. You find yourself in the archives now, surrounded by the musty smell of old parchment and the weight of centuries-old ink on vellum. These are not mythological texts or religious scriptures. These are legal documents, marriage contracts, property deeds, royal proclamations, that meticulously track the descent of Europe's ruling families through centuries and, in some cases, millennia. The genealogical record of European royalty is perhaps the most thoroughly documented lineage system in human history, maintained by heralds, priests, and archivists with obsessive precision. And what these records reveal, when you examine them carefully, is startling. Nearly every royal house in Europe traces its ancestry back to a remarkably small number of common ancestors, creating a web of interrelated bloodlines that has ruled the continent for more than 1,000 years. The starting point for understanding this genealogical web is Charlemagne, Charles the Great, King of the Franks, who ruled from 768 to 814 CE and was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800. Charlemagne's coronation represented more than political theater. It was a deliberate attempt to revive the Roman Empire, to reconnect Christian Europe with the imperial bloodlines of Rome, and to establish a new dynasty that would unite Germanic tribal power with Roman legitimacy and Christian divine sanction. Charlemagne's own ancestry, carefully documented in the Frankish royal chronicles, traces back through the Carolingian dynasty to the earlier Merovingians, those peculiar long-haired kings who claimed descent from a sea creature and maintained their own legends of special, perhaps divine, heritage. The Merovingian line had been displaced when Charles Martel, Charlemagne's grandfather, established his family's control of the Frankish kingdom in the early 8th century. But the Carolingians did not entirely reject Merovingian legitimacy. Instead, they incorporated it, with Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, marrying into Merovingian-connected nobility before finally assuming the crown himself in 751. The significance of this pattern cannot be overstated. Power in medieval Europe did not simply flow to the strongest warlord or the most effective administrator. It required genealogical legitimacy, a demonstrable connection to previous rulers, a bloodline that could be verified and traced. When you examine the hundreds of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities that emerged from the fragments of Charlemagne's empire after his death, you find that nearly all of their ruling families could trace their descent, directly or through female lines, back to Charlemagne himself. But Charlemagne's own documented genealogy goes back only to the 6th century, to his direct ancestors among the Frankish nobility and mayors of the palace. The more ambitious genealogists of the medieval period, however, did not stop there. They pushed the Frankish royal line back through the migration period, through the chaos of the 4th and 5th centuries when Germanic tribes moved across the collapsing Roman Empire, back to the tribal kings who led their people out of Scandinavia and the Baltic regions. These earlier generations are less certain, the documentation more fragmentary, but the pattern remains consistent. The genealogies claim descent from gods. The Anglo-Saxon royal houses of England trace their ancestry to Odin in Norse mythology. The Swedish royal line claimed descent from Yngvi Freyr, one of the Vanir gods. The Danish kings traced their lineage to Dan, son of Ipper, whose own ancestry went back to the gods. These were not considered metaphorical relationships. The royal genealogies presented them as literal descent, as blood, relationships that conveyed something tangible from the divine to the human. You must understand that these genealogical claims had practical consequences. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, his claim to the English throne rested partly on genealogy. William was not merely a powerful Duke of Normandy. He was descended through his great-great-great-grandmother from Rollo, the Viking chieftain who had been granted Normandy by the Frankish King Charles the Simple in 911. Rollo's own ancestry was traced back through the Scandinavian royal lines to the gods. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson, whom William defeated at Hastings, could trace his ancestry through the Anglo-Saxon royal house of Wessex back to Cerdic and ultimately to Woden. The Norman conquest did not eliminate the Anglo-Saxon royal bloodline. It merged with it. William married Matilda of Flanders, who carried both Carolingian and Anglo-Saxon royal blood through her mother. Their descendants, who would rule England for centuries, combined Norman, Anglo-Saxon, Carolingian, and ultimately Merovingian bloodlines into a concentrated royal heritage. This was not accidental. Medieval marriages, particularly royal marriages, were strategic genetic projects designed to combine and concentrate specific bloodlines. The Plantagenet dynasty, which ruled England from 1154 to 1485, provides you with an extraordinary example of how these bloodlines intertwined across Europe. The dynasty began when Henry II, great-grandson of William the Conqueror, married Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was herself one of the most powerful and remarkable figures of the medieval period. Eleanor had previously been married to Louis VII of France, making her Queen of France before that marriage was annulled. As Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, one of the largest and wealthiest territories in France, she brought vast lands and an impeccable pedigree to her marriage with Henry. Eleanor's ancestry connected to the highest nobility of France and, through various lines, back to Charlemagne and beyond. Her children with Henry II would marry into the royal houses of Castile, Sicily, and the Holy Roman Empire, creating a web of alliances and bloodline connections that spanned Europe. When you trace the descent of these Plantagenet children forward through time, you find their genes spreading through virtually every subsequent royal house in Europe. This genealogical concentration accelerated during the late medieval and early modern periods. By the 15th century, the major royal houses of Europe, England, France, Spain, Portugal, Scotland, the various German principalities, the Italian states, Poland, Hungary, were all intermarrying with such consistency that they formed essentially a single extended family. The Habsburgs, who would come to dominate much of Europe, were particularly systematic in their marriage strategy, captured in their famous motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." The Habsburgs traced their own ancestry back through various lines to the Carolingians and ultimately claimed descent from the Merovingians. Through centuries of calculated marriages, they accumulated territories, titles, and bloodlines from across Europe. By the 16th century, when Charles V ruled as Holy Roman Emperor, he controlled Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, much of Italy, and vast territories in the New World. This unprecedented concentration of power rested not primarily on military conquest, but on genealogy, on the careful accumulation and preservation of bloodline claims through marriage. The documentation of these royal genealogies was not a casual enterprise. Each royal house maintained archives staffed by specialized genealogists and heralds whose full-time occupation was tracking bloodlines, verifying claims, and arranging marriages that would strengthen or concentrate desirable genetic connections. The Spanish court under Philip II in the late 16th century employed dozens of genealogists who maintained not just the family tree of the Spanish Habsburgs, but comprehensive records of all European nobility, tracking which families carried which bloodlines, which marriages would produce children with the most concentrated royal heritage. When you examine these genealogies, you notice certain names appearing repeatedly, certain lineages that were particularly prized and deliberately preserved. The Carolingian descent was always valuable, but so were connections to the Byzantine imperial line, to the Crusader kingdoms of the Holy Land, and to certain noble families whose ancestry was traced back to the late Roman period. The genealogists knew what modern genetics has only recently confirmed, that intensive inbreeding would produce genetic problems. They attempted to manage this by occasionally introducing fresh blood from carefully selected noble families whose own genealogies, while perhaps less prestigious, carried fewer accumulated genetic disorders. But the selection of these families was not random. The genealogical archives reveal that when royal houses needed to introduce new blood, they preferentially chose families whose own ancestry, when traced back far enough, connected to the same ancient bloodlines. A 16th century Habsburg might marry a German countess from a relatively minor family, but the genealogists would verify that this countess's maternal great-great-grandmother had carried Carolingian descent through a junior branch of an old Frankish noble house. The appearance of new blood masked the reality of continued endogamy within a larger but still restricted genetic population. The Reformation and the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries did not break this pattern. They reinforced it. Protestant royal houses married other Protestant nobility. Catholic houses married Catholic families, but both groups continued to prioritize genealogical purity and demonstrable descent from the ancient royal lines. When Elizabeth of England chose not to marry, she broke a centuries-old tradition and created a succession crisis that would ultimately bring the Stuart dynasty, descended from the Scottish royal line, to the English throne. The Stuarts traced their own ancestry back through the Scottish kings to the Irish high kings, and according to some genealogies, to the Scythian princes and ultimately to Egyptian pharaohs. These more exotic genealogical claims, Scottish kings descended from Egyptian princesses, are usually dismissed by modern historians as medieval fabrications. And certainly, the specific details are historically unsupportable. There is no evidence of Egyptian princesses traveling to ancient Ireland. But the persistence of these claims across multiple cultures and centuries points to something important: the belief that royal bloodlines had an Eastern origin, that they connected back to the ancient Near Eastern civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Canaan, where the original claims of divine or semi-divine ancestry arose. The medieval genealogists who traced these exotic descents were not stupid. They were among the most educated people of their time, with access to extensive archives and chronicles. When they claimed that Scottish or Irish royalty descended from Scythian princes, they were working from ancient texts, now lost, that recorded migrations and intermarriages between the peoples of the ancient world. Some of these texts may have been legendary, but others were historical records that preserved real population movements and genetic exchanges. Modern genetic studies have begun, in some cases, to vindicate aspects of these ancient genealogical traditions. A 2006 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics found that a specific Y chromosome signature, haplogroup R1b, is present in high concentrations in Ireland, Scotland, and the Basque region of Spain. Precisely the areas where medieval genealogies claimed ancient migrations from the Eastern Mediterranean. This haplogroup originated in the Middle East or Central Asia and spread westward during the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age, exactly when the legendary migrations recorded in medieval genealogies supposedly occurred. This does not prove that Irish kings descended from Egyptian pharaohs, but it does confirm that significant genetic connections exist between populations that medieval genealogists, working without any concept of genetics, somehow identified as related. They detected real patterns in the biological data, even though they lacked the scientific framework to understand what they were seeing. The 18th and 19th centuries brought dramatic political changes to Europe. Revolutions, the rise of constitutional monarchies, the spread of democratic ideals. But these changes did little to disrupt the genealogical concentration of royal bloodlines. Even as kings lost political power, they retained social prestige and continued to marry almost exclusively within the same restricted pool of families. By the time of the First World War, the major antagonists, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and King George V of Britain, were all first cousins, grandchildren of Queen Victoria. They called each other Willie, Nicky, and Georgie in their personal correspondence. The war that killed millions and destroyed empires was, at one level, a family quarrel. The fall of most European monarchies after World War I did not eliminate these bloodlines. It merely removed them from direct political power. The descendants of the royal houses continued to exist, continued to maintain their genealogical records, and continued to marry preferentially within their extended family. Today, if you trace the ancestry of the remaining European monarchs, in Britain, Spain, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, you find they are all descended from Queen Victoria and from numerous other common ancestors, going back through the royal lines of Europe. But here is where the story becomes relevant to your present-day experience. These bloodlines did not remain confined to Europe. As European powers colonized the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania, the colonial administrators, governors, and military leaders who implemented and maintained these colonial systems were drawn disproportionately from the European nobility and gentry, the same families whose genealogies connected to the royal bloodlines. When these colonies eventually became independent nations, the power structures often remained in the hands of elites whose ancestry, when traced back, connected to the European ruling classes. The United States, founded on explicitly anti-monarchical principles, nonetheless developed its own aristocracy drawn heavily from families with documented descent from European nobility. A genealogical study published in 1995 found that all but one U.S. president can trace their ancestry to European royalty. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, the revolutionary founders, were all descended from English kings. This was not accidental. The colonial leadership of British America was drawn from the British gentry class, and the gentry class consisted of junior branches of the nobility, families whose own ancestry connected to the royal lines through female descents or cadet branches. This pattern continues into the present. When you examine the genealogy of recent U.S. presidents, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, each one can be traced back through various lines to European royalty. The connections are sometimes distant, running through dozens of generations. But they exist and they are documented. What you must ask yourself is whether this pattern is purely coincidental, a mere artifact of the fact that anyone with European ancestry likely has some royal descent if you go back far enough, or whether it reflects something more systematic about how elite families preserve power and status across generations. The genealogical research suggests the latter. While it is true that most people of European descent have some royal ancestors, if you trace back far enough, a mathematical consequence of exponential genealogical growth, what distinguishes modern political elites is not merely that they have some royal ancestry, but that they have unusually concentrated royal ancestry. They descend from the royal lines through multiple paths. They carry higher than average percentages of DNA from specific royal ancestors, and their families have maintained records of these connections and, in some cases, consciously preserved them through marriage patterns. The question that should occupy your mind as you trace these bloodlines from ancient Mesopotamia through medieval Europe to the present day is not whether ancient kings were literally descended from gods or Nephilim. The question is whether a relatively small number of interrelated families have maintained genetic and social continuity for thousands of years, whether they have consciously preserved what they believe to be special bloodlines, and whether those bloodlines correlate with unusual concentrations of political, economic, and social power. If the answer to these questions is yes, as the genealogical evidence suggests it might be, then you must reconsider fundamental assumptions about how power operates in human civilization, about whether democracy and meritocracy are real, or merely surface phenomena masking deeper continuities of bloodline and family. Section 2 continues this investigation by examining what might be preserved in these bloodlines. not metaphysically, but biologically, genetically, and culturally. The project of maintaining royal bloodlines was not merely about legitimizing political power, though it certainly served that function. It was also based on beliefs, whether justified or not, that these bloodlines carried specific traits, abilities, or characteristics that made their bearers fundamentally different from ordinary people. The medieval concept of blue blood provides you with a concrete example. This term, which originally emerged in Spain as sangre azul, referred to the visible veins of pale-skinned nobles who had not intermarried with darker-skinned Moors during the centuries of Islamic rule in Iberia. The phrase encoded a genetic marker, pale skin that had been preserved through endogamy, with social and political significance. Blue blood meant pure blood, blood that had not been contaminated by intermarriage with outsiders. But the concept went deeper than mere skin color. The Spanish and other European nobilities believed that their bloodlines carried inherent qualities: courage, nobility of spirit, refined sensibility, natural leadership. These were not considered learned traits, but inherited ones, passed through the blood from parent to child. Modern genetics has taught you that this belief was both wrong and right. It was wrong in the sense that complex behavioral and psychological traits are not determined by simple genetic inheritance, and certainly not by the specific bloodline patterns that medieval Europeans tracked. But it was right in recognizing that genetics matter, that heredity influences human traits, and that selective breeding, which is what royal marriage patterns constituted, could concentrate specific genetic characteristics. The Habsburg jaw, that pronounced underbite that characterized the Spanish Habsburg line, demonstrates this principle clearly. This trait was not mysterious or supernatural. It was the result of specific genetic variants that became concentrated through repeated inbreeding. Modern analysis has identified the genetic basis of mandibular prognathism and traced its accumulation in the Habsburg line. But while the Habsburg jaw was a visible genetic marker, what about less visible traits? What about intelligence, temperament, cognitive abilities, or even more subtle neurological characteristics that might influence how individuals process information, make decisions, or exercise power? The field of behavioral genetics has established that many psychological and cognitive traits are heritable, though the genetic architecture is complex and involves many genes interacting with environmental factors. Intelligence, as measured by IQ tests, has a heritability estimate of approximately 0.5 to 0.8 in adults, meaning that 50 to 80% of the variation in IQ in a population can be attributed to genetic differences. Personality traits like conscientiousness, openness, and extroversion also show significant heritability. Even political attitudes and religious beliefs show some genetic influence, though the mechanisms are not well understood. If these traits are heritable, and if royal families practiced intensive inbreeding for centuries, then you would expect to see specific psychological and cognitive profiles emerging in royal bloodlines. The historical record provides some evidence for this. European royal families showed unusually high rates of certain psychological conditions. The Wittelsbach dynasty of Bavaria, for instance, had numerous members diagnosed with severe mental illness, including Ludwig II, the Mad King of Bavaria, who built fantastic castles and became increasingly detached from reality before his mysterious death in 1886. The Romanov dynasty of Russia similarly showed patterns of psychological instability, with several Tsars exhibiting signs of paranoia, depression, or other mental health issues. But the royal bloodlines also produced individuals of extraordinary capability. Elizabeth I of England, Frederick the Great of Prussia, Maria Theresa of Austria. These were not merely privileged individuals who happened to inherit thrones. They were exceptionally intelligent, politically astute, and capable of wielding power effectively in extremely complex circumstances. When you survey European history, you find that royal bloodlines, despite the genetic load of inbreeding, produced a disproportionate number of highly capable individuals who shaped the course of civilization. This paradox, that intensive inbreeding produced both genetic disorders and extraordinary individuals, makes sense if you understand that genetic concentration works in both directions. Deleterious recessive genes become expressed, causing genetic diseases, but advantageous gene combinations can also be concentrated, producing individuals with unusual abilities. If the royal bloodlines began with individuals who possessed unusual cognitive or psychological traits, whether through random mutation, through genetic isolation, or through some other mechanism, then the project of preserving those bloodlines through endogamy would concentrate whatever genetic factors underlaid those traits. What specific traits might have been preserved? The historical record suggests several possibilities. First, an unusual tolerance for, or even comfort with wielding power over others. Most humans, research suggests, are uncomfortable with holding power over other people and exercise authority reluctantly. But royal bloodlines selected for individuals who could comfortably command armies, make life and death decisions, and rule over millions. This might reflect genetic variations in empathy, in social dominance orientation, or in the neural circuits that process social hierarchy. Second, enhanced strategic thinking and long-term planning abilities. Royal families had to think in terms of generations, arranging marriages and alliances that would benefit their descendants decades or centuries in the future. This required cognitive abilities that went beyond immediate tactical thinking. An ability to model complex social and political dynamics over extended time periods. The genealogical records show that royal families tracked their ancestry and planned their marriages with extraordinary foresight, sometimes arranging marriages for children or even infants based on genealogical projections of how those unions would affect bloodlines and territorial holdings multiple generations hence. Third, and perhaps most interestingly, an unusual relationship to ordinary social norms and moral constraints. Royal bloodlines across cultures show a pattern of behavior that would be considered psychopathic in ordinary individuals. A willingness to kill rivals, including family members. A comfort with deception and manipulation. A sense of being above normal moral and legal constraints. But these same individuals often showed genuine care for their subjects, implemented beneficial policies, and created stable governing systems. This suggests not psychopathy exactly, but a different moral psychology, one that could operate simultaneously on multiple moral planes, ruthless in protecting dynastic interests, but principled in governing. Modern neuroscience has begun to identify genetic variants and brain structures associated with these traits. The MAOA gene, sometimes called the warrior gene, has variants that correlate with increased aggression and risk-taking behavior, particularly in males. Variations in the dopamine receptor genes, DRD2 and DRD404, correlate with novelty-seeking behavior and reduced sensitivity to social norms. Certain brain structure differences, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, associate with both reduced empathy and enhanced strategic thinking abilities. You must not jump to conclusions here. The genetics of complex behavioral traits is extraordinarily complicated, and no simple genetic profile produces the royal personality. But if royal bloodlines selected for specific psychological traits over many generations, and if those traits had any genetic basis at all, then you would expect to see genetic signatures in these populations that differ from the general population. No such comprehensive genetic study of royal bloodlines has been published. But the existence of distinctive physical markers, like the Habsburg jaw, suggests that distinctive psychological markers might also exist. The cultural transmission of these traits is perhaps even more important than the genetic transmission. Royal children were raised in specific environments designed to cultivate the abilities and mindsets appropriate for rule. They learned multiple languages, studied history and philosophy, received military training, and were taught from birth that they were fundamentally different from ordinary people. This socialization might have been more important than genetics in producing the royal personality. But the two factors worked together. Genetic predispositions were amplified by cultural practices, and cultural practices were maintained because they successfully produced individuals capable of wielding power. When these royal bloodlines spread beyond Europe through colonization and intermarriage with local elites, they carried both their genetic heritage and their cultural practices. The British Empire, at its height, was administered by a relatively small number of families from the British aristocracy and gentry, families whose genealogy connected them to the royal bloodlines. These families staffed the colonial office, the military officer corps, the governorships and administrative positions that ruled a quarter of the world's population. They brought with them not just British law and institutions, but British assumptions about hierarchy, about the natural ordering of society, about who should rule and who should be ruled. The legacy of this system persists. When you examine the leadership of formerly colonized nations, you often find that the post-colonial elites are descended from families who collaborated with colonial authorities, who intermarried with colonial administrators, or who were educated in colonial institutions specifically designed to create indigenous ruling classes that shared the values and often the genealogical connections of the colonizers. The result is a global elite that, when you trace their ancestry, connects back through various paths to the European royal bloodlines, and, through those lines, to the ancient noble families of the Near East, who first made claims about special ancestry. This is not a conspiracy in the usual sense. There is no secret organization directing this process, but there is a pattern, a system of reinforcing relationships between genealogy, education, wealth, marriage patterns, and access to power that has perpetuated itself for millennia. The families who rule today are, in many cases, literally descended from the families who ruled centuries or millennia ago. They maintain this position not primarily through coercion, but through subtler mechanisms: educational gatekeeping, social networks, marriage patterns, and cultural transmission of the skills and mindsets required to operate at elite levels. The question you must ask yourself is whether this pattern is coincidental or whether it reflects something deeper about human social organization. Do these bloodlines persist in power because random historical factors happen to advantage certain families, which then perpetuate their advantages through social mechanisms available to any wealthy family? Or do they persist because there is something genuinely distinctive about these bloodlines, genetically, culturally, or both, that makes their members more capable of acquiring and maintaining power than individuals from non-elite backgrounds? The evidence suggests elements of both. Wealth and social connection obviously provide enormous advantages that have nothing to do with inherent capability. A mediocre individual born into an elite family will likely achieve more than a brilliant individual born into poverty, simply because of the resources and opportunities available. But the elite families themselves seem to believe that they carry something more than mere social advantages. They maintain their genealogical records. They preferentially marry within their class. They educate their children in specific ways designed to cultivate elite capabilities. This behavior suggests a belief that bloodline matters, that who your ancestors were influences what you can become. The persistence of these beliefs and practices into the present day is striking. Despite centuries of Enlightenment thought celebrating reason over tradition, despite revolutions fought in the name of equality, despite scientific evidence that genetic differences between human populations are minor, the elite families of the world continue to behave as if bloodline is paramount. They marry within their class, they track their genealogy, they send their children to the same schools that educated their ancestors. They maintain social networks that exclude outsiders. This is not irrational if bloodline actually matters in some way. If the genetic and cultural inheritances carried by these families genuinely do confer capabilities that are difficult to acquire through other means. Section 3 now brings this investigation to its contemporary conclusion. To the question that has been building throughout this exploration: if these bloodlines exist, if they have maintained themselves for millennia, if they carry distinctive genetic and cultural characteristics, and if they concentrate power in the present day, what does this mean for you? For how you understand the world you live in, and for the prospects of human civilization going forward. The first and most important point is that the genealogical connections between ancient royal bloodlines and modern leaders are not speculative or theoretical. They are documented, public, and verifiable. When the New England Historic Genealogical Society published research in 2012 showing that all U.S. presidents except Martin Van Buren descend from King John of England, 1166 to 1216, they were not promoting conspiracy theories. They were reporting the results of standard genealogical research using public records, church registries, and documented family trees. King John himself, though a relatively minor and unsuccessful king, was a descendant of William the Conqueror of Charlemagne, and through various lines of the Merovingian kings, and ultimately of the Roman imperial families. The genealogical path from King John to modern American presidents runs through hundreds of documented individuals whose births, marriages, and deaths were recorded by churches, governments, and family archives. There is no missing link, no speculative leap. The connections are as certain as historical documentation can make them. This same pattern holds for other modern leaders. British prime ministers, French presidents, German chancellors, the leaders of international organizations. When their genealogies are traced, they consistently connect back to the same small pool of European noble families. The probability of this occurring by chance, given the number of ancestors each person has, going back even a few centuries, is vanishingly small. It suggests that access to elite leadership positions continues to be strongly correlated with descent from historical ruling families. But you must be careful not to overinterpret this finding. The correlation between elite ancestry and modern leadership might reflect nothing more than social and economic advantages that persist across generations. Wealthy families can provide better education, better nutrition, better health care, better social connections, all of which increase the probability that their descendants will achieve leadership positions. This explanation requires no genetic hypothesis, no special bloodline characteristics, just the straightforward observation that privilege perpetuates itself. Yet this explanation struggles with certain observations. First, elite families show remarkable resilience across revolutionary upheavals that supposedly destroyed their advantages. The French Revolution guillotined the aristocracy, confiscated their property, and attempted to create a society based on equality. Yet within a generation, many of the same families had recovered their wealth and influence. The Russian Revolution was even more thorough, executing the Romanovs and thousands of nobles, exiling survivors, and attempting to eliminate the class system entirely. Yet even in the Soviet Union, elite positions were disproportionately filled by individuals whose ancestry connected to the old Russian nobility, or to equivalent elite families from other populations. Second, elite families maintain their position even when they lose economic advantages. Numerous European noble families were financially ruined by the world wars, losing estates and wealth that had been accumulated over centuries. Yet their descendants often retained or regained elite positions through other means: education, marriage, social networks. Something beyond mere wealth seems to be inherited, some set of capabilities or mindsets that allows individuals from these families to succeed, even when starting from reduced material circumstances. Third, the specific pattern of elite intermarriage persists even when there is no obvious material advantage to doing so. In the contemporary world, where formal aristocracy has little legal meaning and where wealth can be found in many families with no royal connections, why do descendants of royal lines continue to preferentially marry each other? Why do European royal families still arrange marriages with each other? And why do the families of American and European political and business elites intermarry with such regularity? The social registers of major cities. The lists of families considered old money or truly elite show remarkable genealogical interconnection and, when traced back, consistent descent from the same historical royal and noble lines. The most disturbing possibility is that these bloodlines have maintained themselves because they carry real genetic and cultural advantages for acquiring and wielding power, and that these advantages have been deliberately cultivated and preserved. This would not require any supernatural explanation. It would simply require that human populations subjected to strong selection pressure for specific traits, in this case, the ability to rule over others, would evolve genetic and cultural characteristics that enhance those traits. Royal bloodlines practiced selective breeding for political and social dominance for thousands of years. If heredity influences behavioral and cognitive traits at all, then this selective breeding should have produced detectable effects. The ethical implications of this possibility are profound and uncomfortable. It would suggest that humanity is not genetically or psychologically egalitarian, that different populations carry different average predispositions for various traits, and that these differences have been systematically cultivated and maintained by ruling classes. This directly contradicts the egalitarian assumptions that underlie modern democratic theory, which assumes that all humans have roughly equal capacity for reason, for moral judgment, for self-governance. If ruling families actually do carry genetic and cultural inheritances that make them more capable of wielding power, then democracy might be less about genuine popular sovereignty and more about managing the relationship between elite rulers and mass populations. But you must also consider the possibility that these bloodline advantages, if they exist, are becoming less relevant in the modern world. The traits that allowed ancient kings to rule successfully, physical dominance, willingness to use violence, ability to command personal loyalty through charisma and kinship ties, may be less important in contemporary technocratic governance systems. Modern leaders must manage complex bureaucracies, understand technical and economic systems, and operate through legal and institutional frameworks that constrain personal authority. These demands might require different capabilities than those cultivated in royal bloodlines. Yet when you examine who succeeds in modern systems, you find the same families appearing repeatedly. The Bushes in American politics, the Churchills in British leadership, the various branches of the Rothschild family in international finance, the genealogical connections between figures like Winston Churchill and Princess Diana, or between George W. Bush and Barack Obama, both descended from John Lackland through different lines, or between numerous Silicon Valley tech leaders and old American families whose own ancestry traces to European nobility. These connections are public, documented, and statistically improbable if leadership position is truly meritocratic and unrelated to ancestry. The most balanced conclusion is that bloodline is one factor among many that influences leadership and power, that it matters more than contemporary egalitarian ideology admits, but less than ancient claims about divine descent would suggest. The families who rule today are connected to the families who ruled in the past, and this connection carries both genetic and cultural inheritances that influence capability and opportunity. But these inheritances are not deterministic. They interact with environmental factors, and individuals from non-elite backgrounds can and do develop similar capabilities through other routes. What should concern you is not whether these bloodlines exist, they demonstrably do, but whether the concentration of power in specific family lines, maintained over millennia, serves human flourishing or constrains it. If the same small number of interrelated families have shaped human civilization for thousands of years, making the decisions that led to wars, colonial exploitation, economic systems that generate massive inequality, and environmental degradation that threatens the planet, then perhaps the persistence of these bloodlines is not a sign of superior capability, but simply a sign of successful self-perpetuation by a ruling class whose interests diverge from those of humanity as a whole. The Nephilim narrative, whether you interpret it literally or metaphorically, captures something important about this pattern: the idea that a small group of beings who are fundamentally different from ordinary humanity has ruled over human civilization since its beginning, that their bloodlines have been deliberately preserved, and that they continue to shape human destiny according to their own interests and priorities. Whether these beings were literally the offspring of angels and humans, or simply represent the first human elites who concentrated power and developed the cultural and genetic characteristics necessary to maintain it, matters less than the recognition that human civilization has never been truly egalitarian, that power has always concentrated in specific bloodlines, and that these bloodlines persist into the present day. As you drift toward sleep, let these thoughts settle in your mind. The genealogies are real, the bloodlines persist, the families who rule today are connected to the families who have always ruled. This is not conspiracy theory, but documented history. What you do with this knowledge, how it shapes your understanding of power and possibility in the modern world, is a question each person must answer for themselves. But to ignore these patterns, to pretend that ancestry and bloodline have no influence on who holds power, is to misunderstand the basic structure of human civilization and to blind yourself to how power actually operates beneath the surface of democratic and meritocratic ideals.